Good evening. Tonight we begin with the story of how English football was quietly taken apart and put back together as something else entirely. England in the summer of 1992 smelled of money arriving somewhere just out of sight. The kind of money nobody had really thought possible in a game that had spent 30 years being cold and proud and broke. The terraces were still there, the pies were still grey in the middle, but something in the air had changed, and the men who noticed it first were not footballers. They were television executives, sitting in rooms, doing arithmetic. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let us know in the comments what the next video should be about. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's slowly ease into tonight's story. There is a version of English football that most people under 30 have never really seen, not on television at least, not in the form it actually existed, muddy and loud and badly lit with 40,000 people packed onto uncovered terraces, watching players who earned roughly what a primary school teacher earns today. It was a world of flat caps and cigarette smoke and the particular sort of noise that comes from a crowd that is completely unsegregated, all standing together in the cold, swaying slightly, which was not always a choice. The Football League had existed since 1888. By the 1980s, the top division, the First Division, was one of the most watched leagues in the world, in the sense that people cared about it enormously, even if the stadiums were falling apart around them. The grounds had not been substantially rebuilt since before the war. The fabric of English football, the physical places where people gathered, week after week for the better part of a century, had been allowed to decay in ways that, in retrospect, made what followed not a surprise but an inevitability. In May 1985, a fire broke out at Bradford City's Valley Parade during a match against Lincoln City. 56 supporters died. 11 days later, a wall collapsed at Heysel Stadium in Brussels before a European Cup final between Liverpool and Juventus. 39 people died, mostly Italian supporters. Both disasters in different ways demanded a reckoning with the conditions in which English football was being watched. Then came the 15th of April 1989. Sheffield Wednesday's Hillsborough Ground, a Football Association Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. A gate was opened to relieve pressure outside the Leppings Lane end, and in the ensuing crush, 97 Liverpool supporters died. The youngest was 10 years old. For a long time afterwards, the truth of what had happened and who bore responsibility for it was obscured by official accounts that did not reflect what the evidence showed. The full truth took decades to establish, and the fight to establish it was carried on by the families of those who died, who did not stop until it was acknowledged. The Taylor Report, published in January 1990, was the formal response. Its central recommendation was clear: the terraces had to go. All-seater stadiums were now mandatory for the top flight. This was not a commercial decision. It was a recognition that the way English football had been experienced, standing, packed together on uncovered concrete, had cost too many people their lives. This was the context in which the Premier League was born. Not idealism, not a great vision for the future of the sport. Necessity and opportunity arriving at the same moment. The biggest clubs had already understood something that the Football League's structure made inconvenient. Gate receipts and television money, under the existing arrangements, were shared across 92 clubs. The top clubs were subsidising the lower divisions, which is a generous way of saying that Arsenal were helping to pay for clubs they had never heard of and would never play. The solution, once someone had the nerve to say it aloud, was obvious. Keep the money in-house. Create something new, give it a grander name. England's semi-final run at the 1990 World Cup in Italy helped, in ways that are difficult to fully explain. Paul Gascoigne's tears, beamed around the world, made football fashionable again among people who had spent the previous decade being embarrassed by it. The sport was changing its own image, or having its image changed for it, which is not quite the same thing but produces similar results. The world that existed in August 1992 was one in which a top English footballer earned perhaps £3,000 or £4,000 a week.
in which the goalkeepers could still pick up deliberate back passes from their own defenders, in which squad numbers had not yet been introduced, so players wore 1 through 11 regardless of position, because that was how it had always been done and nobody had thought to change it, in which most matches were played on surfaces that, by December, resembled the kind of thing you might find at the bottom of a riverbed. That world was about to end, not slowly, quite quickly in fact. Within a decade, almost nothing would be the same.
The summer of 1990 was not like other summers, though it looked, on the surface, exactly like one. The clubs were preparing for the new season. The managers were doing their pre-season tours. The players were getting fitter in ways that, given some of what was still being eaten before matches, were perhaps less effective than the coaches hoped. On the surface, the First Division was the First Division, as it had been for decades. Underneath the surface, a small number of people in rooms with no windows were having conversations that would change English football permanently. Greg Dyke was at the time the managing director of London Weekend Television, a man who knew television and who had noticed, as television executives tend to, that football was generating enormous audiences for relatively modest sums. The existing broadcast arrangements were not, from the club's perspective, particularly generous. ITV held rights, the money was distributed widely, and widely in this context meant thinly. Dyke arranged meetings with the chairman of what were then known as the Big Five: Arsenal, Everton, Liverpool, Manchester United and Tottenham Hotspur. The proposition was simple: leave the Football League, form something new. The television deal would follow. The big clubs were already doing the arithmetic and arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion, that the existing structure was preventing them from becoming what they could be. The European ban had cost them years of income and development. The domestic structure was redistributing money they could otherwise have spent on themselves. The Football Association, which had existed in a state of low-intensity warfare with the Football League for decades, saw an opportunity. If the top clubs broke away and formed a new competition under the FA's umbrella, the Football League, the FA's historic rival, would be significantly weakened. The FA gave the breakaway its blessing. This was, it must be said, less a matter of principle than a matter of convenience. But convenience, in football, has driven most of the significant decisions. In 1991, the First Division clubs resigned from the Football League en masse. The FA Premier League was incorporated as a new company. 22 clubs would begin the inaugural season. The number would reduce to 20 in 1995 to 96. Fewer matches, more money, more time, and a more manageable schedule for the clubs that would shortly be competing in Europe again. The television rights auction that followed produced something nobody in the Football League had anticipated. ITV, which had held rights and expected to retain them, were outbid. Sky, the satellite broadcaster owned by Rupert Murdoch, submitted a bid of £304 million over 5 years. The deal was championed behind the scenes by Alan Sugar, then chairman of Tottenham Hotspur, who was also the chairman of Amstrad, the company that manufactured the satellite dishes through which Sky's signal was received. Sugar reportedly urged Sky's executives to blow ITV out of the water. They did exactly that. The implications took a while to become clear. Football had been moved behind a paywall. For the first time in the sport's history, a significant portion of the most important matches were not accessible without a subscription and a piece of hardware on your roof. Some supporters were furious, others got the dish. The audience figures that followed suggested that in the long run, most people found a way to watch. The 15th of August 1992, the Premier League begins. It began, as it happened, at Bramall Lane, where Sheffield United hosted Manchester United in one of the early afternoon kickoffs. The first goal of the new era was scored by Brian Deane, a tall, direct centre-forward who headed in from a long throw-in after 5 minutes. He wheeled away in celebration in front of a crowd that, in the photographs from that afternoon, looks almost exactly like a crowd from any English football photograph taken in the previous 40 years. The shorts are baggy, the pitch is uneven. There are no sponsors visible on the hoardings that would become cliched a decade later. Nobody in the ground that afternoon had any real sense of what had begun. The football looked like the football they had always watched because it was. The name on the competition was new. Most of everything else was still the same. It would not stay that way. The 22 clubs who began the Premier League in August 92 included some who had no real business being at the same financial level as the clubs who had organised the breakaway. That tension between the clubs who had engineered the new arrangement and the clubs who were simply present for it would define the next 30 years of English football. Some would rise, several would fall, a few would return and fall again. The ones who had drawn up the plans for the most part stayed exactly where they had intended to. The Premier League had begun as a solution to a financial problem. What it would become was something considerably stranger and more spectacular than anyone in those windowless rooms had imagined. Manchester United had not won the First Division title since 1967. That is worth sitting with for a moment. 26 years. The club that had produced Bobby Charlton and George Best and Dennis Law, the club of the Munich air disaster and the 1968 European Cup, had spent a quarter of a century watching other clubs lift the trophy they felt was theirs by heritage and expectation. Liverpool had won it 11 times in that period. Arsenal had won it twice. Leeds, Everton, Aston Villa, clubs that Manchester United considered lesser, had all won it. The drought was becoming embarrassing. Alex Ferguson had arrived in November 1986 with a specific mandate: win the league title. It took him until the first year of the Premier League to do it. The timing was either ironic or appropriate, depending on how you felt about the manager and the institution. In the inaugural 1992-93 season, United finished on 84 points, a total that, in the old system of 2 points for a win, would have been barely credible. Under 3 points for a win, it was merely convincing. They won the title by 10 points. The catalyst, though, the signing that seemed to shift something not just tactically but atmospherically, had arrived 2 months before the season ended. In November 1992, Leeds United sold Eric Cantona to Manchester United for £1,200,000. This was, by any objective assessment, a remarkable piece of business for United. For Leeds, it remains a source of a particular type of quiet anguish that tends to emerge in pubs on slow evenings. Eric Cantona was not like other footballers. He knew this, and he made sure others knew it too, without ever having to say so directly. He wore his collar up, which was technically a small thing and yet somehow communicated something enormous about the relationship between self-regard and performance. He moved at a pace that seemed slightly disconnected from the urgency around him, as though he had already decided where the ball was going and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. He was, in the words of people who played alongside him, different in a way that had no adequate vocabulary. He was also, periodically, a significant problem. On the 25th of January 1995 at Selhurst Park in South London, Eric Cantona received a red card against Crystal Palace and was walking towards the tunnel when a Palace supporter moved towards him, shouting things that remain documented in the subsequent court proceedings. Eric Cantona launched himself at the man with a flying kick. The assault was filmed, replayed and discussed at a volume that made the previous records for football controversies seem quiet by comparison. He was banned from football for 8 months. There were suggestions his career was over. And into the space they left, Blackburn Rovers arrived. Blackburn were not a glamorous club. They were a working-class Lancashire town with a stadium that had been significantly improved by the money of Jack Walker, a local businessman who had sold his steel business and decided to spend the proceeds on the football club he had supported since childhood. Walker bankrolled a series of major signings, including the acquisition of Alan Shearer from Southampton in the summer of 1992 for £3.5 million, which would prove to be one of the more efficient purchases in the history of the league. Under Kenny Dalglish, himself a legendary figure from his Liverpool playing days, now managing for the first time since a breakdown had led him to resign from Liverpool in 1991, Blackburn assembled a team built around pace, directness and Shearer's goals. They reached the final day of the 1994-95 season needing a result against Liverpool at Anfield, with United playing West Ham at Upton Park.
Blackburn lost 2-1. United drew 1-1. It did not matter. Blackburn were champions on 89 points, the first club outside the old elite to win the top division in nearly 2 decades.
The Bosman ruling arrived later that year in December 1995, though its effects had been anticipated and partially acted upon throughout the season. Jean-Marc Bosman was a Belgian footballer who had argued successfully before the European Court of Justice that the existing system of transfer fees for out-of-contract players constituted a restraint of free movement under European law. The court agreed. Players whose contracts had expired could now move clubs within the European Union without a transfer fee being paid. The ruling also prohibited quotas on European Union nationals playing for clubs in EU member states, which meant English clubs could now field as many players from other EU countries as they wished. The effects were immediate and in retrospect transformative. The percentage of foreign players in the Premier League rose sharply year on year through the late 90s. The style of the game changed for more technical, more varied, more tactically sophisticated. Clubs began looking to France, to the Netherlands, to Scandinavia, to Italy, for players they could sign cheaply or sign on free transfers at the end of their contracts. The traditional English game, direct, physical, relentless, began to be diluted, which some found troubling and others found entirely welcome. Eric Cantona returned in October 1995 to a United side that had, by then, assembled an extraordinary crop of young players through their academy. David Beckham, Paul Scholes, Nicky Butt, Gary and Phil Neville. Ryan Giggs was already established. The class of 92, as they would become known, were beginning to look like something unusual. Newcastle United had spent the early months of the 1995-96 season playing football of a quality that made neutral observers slightly giddy. Kevin Keegan, as a player one of the most beloved figures in the club's history, had returned as manager and built a team around Chris Waddle, Les Ferdinand, David Ginola, an approach that prioritised excitement over pragmatism in a way that the supporter base found genuinely intoxicating. In January, Newcastle led the table by 12 points. United had games in hand which complicated the picture. A 12-point lead that rests partly on matches not yet played is a different proposition from a 12-point lead after identical fixture counts. But the lead was real, the pressure was real, and the pressure began, very slowly, to show. The manager who wins the mind games rarely does so loudly. Ferguson, in a television interview that spring, suggested that the title race was putting him under enormous strain, that Newcastle, as the chasing club, had no real pressure to deal with while United felt everything. Keegan, watching this, took it as a slight on his players and his club and responded on live television with an extended, trembling declaration of competitive feeling. "I will love it if we beat them, love it." That has been replayed so many times it has acquired an almost mythological quality. He meant every word of it. He also, by saying it, confirmed to anyone watching that something had shifted. United won the title that season and the next. Newcastle, in the summer of 1996, broke the world transfer record by paying £15 million to bring Alan Shearer, a Geordie from the city itself, home from Blackburn. It was the kind of signing that felt, for a brief period, like a statement of intent rather than a farewell gesture. It turned out to be both. Manchester United won 4 of the first 5 Premier League titles. The 5th, Blackburn's, was the exception that proved the rule. By the late 1990s, the structure of the league was settling into something that looked less like open competition and more like a conversation between a small number of very wealthy institutions with occasional interruptions from clubs that got briefly very hot and then cooled. The last of those 5 early titles, in 1998 to 99, produced something nobody had quite seen in English football before, and that nobody has managed since. Manchester United won the Premier League, the FA Cup and the UEFA Champions League in the same season. The treble. The Champions League final in Barcelona's Camp Nou on the 26th of May was played against Bayern Munich, who led 1-0 through the majority of the 90 minutes. United scored twice in stoppage time. First through Teddy Sheringham, then through Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, a substitute who had been on the pitch for less than 10 minutes.
The German players sat on the pitch in the manner of people who have been told something they cannot quite process. The United players ran in directions that suggested coordinated thought had temporarily left them.
Arsène Wenger arrived at Arsenal in October 1996. The English press, which at that point was not especially interested in football managers who had worked in Japan, asked who on earth he was. The answer, as it emerged over the following 8 years, was someone who understood football at a level that made most of the existing approaches look approximate. Wenger was 56 at the time of his appointment, not young, not old, but formed by experiences that were unusual for an English top-flight manager. He had studied economics. He spoke 5 languages. He had managed in France, working with Monaco with considerable success, before moving to Grampus 8 in Japan, where he had absorbed ideas about nutrition and sports science that had not yet reached England in any systematic way. He found, on arrival at Arsenal, a training ground culture built on the principles that had served English football for decades: hard work, physical dominance, and the occasional steak and chips before a match. He changed all of it. The dietary changes happened quickly and created immediate friction. Players who had built careers on particular habits were told politely and immovably that those habits were now historical artifacts. The supplements and vitamins and carefully calibrated nutrition that arrived at Arsenal in the autumn of 1996 would have been, in most Premier League dressing rooms at the time, treated as eccentricity. At Arsenal, they became the baseline. Other clubs, noticing that Arsenal players seemed to be recovering faster and performing later into seasons than expected, began to investigate. What did it mean for the players practically? For the senior players at Arsenal in '96, it meant a period of adjustment that was not always comfortable. For the younger players coming through, it meant they had never known anything different. Within a few years, the training methods and nutritional approaches Wenger had introduced were being described not as foreign eccentricity, but as modern professionalism. The sport caught up with him, in other words. It simply took a few years to admit it was doing so. In the 1997 to 98 season, Arsenal won the double, the Premier League and the FA Cup, by overturning a 12-point deficit that United had established early in the campaign. The precise nature of that comeback and the way it happened, methodically, without drama, with the peculiar patience of a team that had decided it was going to win and simply had not yet got around to doing it, told observers something about the kind of football Wenger was building. The team was anchored by Patrick Vieira, a Frenchman, tall, combative, capable of covering enormous distances in ways that seemed to defy the geometry of the pitch. Alongside him, Emmanuel Petit provided the kind of destructive midfield presence that the phrase midfield presence was probably invented to describe. In attack, Dennis Bergkamp, signed before Wenger's arrival but integrated into the new philosophy with particular care, was producing the kind of football that made commentators pause mid-sentence and begin again. Thierry Henry arrived from Juventus in 1999 for £11 million.
He had struggled at Juventus and was widely regarded as an unresolved talent. Within 2 seasons of working with Wenger, he was the best striker in England. Wenger kept winning things. Arsenal won the double again in 2002. They were Champions League semi-finalists. And then, in the summer of 2003, something quietly extraordinary began to take shape.
The 2003 to 2004 season, 38 matches, 26 wins, 12 draws, 0 losses. Arsenal did not lose a league match for an entire season. They were called the Invincibles, which is the sort of label that tends to get applied retrospectively once the scale of the achievement becomes clear, but which, in this case, was simply accurate. The points total of 90 was not even a record. Chelsea would exceed it the following year. The significance was the inverted line in the record books where the losses should have been. The cleanness of it, 0. To achieve this across 38 matches against 20 teams, across 9 months of English weather and English football and all the accidents and misfortunes that a season generates, requires not just talent but a particular type of collective fortitude that is very difficult to engineer. Wenger had engineered it. It has not been repeated in the Premier League era. Given the subsequent changes to the financial landscape of the sport, The arrival of sovereign wealth, the transfer fees that followed, the talent density at the top of the league, it seems unlikely to be repeated. The players who delivered it were not uniformly superstars. Jens Lehmann in goal was dependable rather than spectacular. Ashley Cole at left back was excellent and knew it, occasionally in ways that created administrative inconveniences. Sol Campbell in central defence had arrived from Tottenham as a free agent, which Tottenham supporters found difficult for many years. Robert Pires, Bergkamp, Thierry Henry, Vieira. A team assembled over years, unified by a single consistent coaching philosophy, performing at a level that the football world paused to acknowledge and then spent the next 20 years trying to explain. Wenger remained at Arsenal until 2018. He never won another Premier League title after 2004. The world changed around him. Specifically, the world changed in July 2003, 4 months before the Invincibles season began. And what had seemed possible for a brilliantly managed club on Arsenal's resources became, over time, considerably less so. The change arrived in the form of a Russian oligarch and a cheque for £140 million. Roman Abramovich bought Chelsea Football Club in July 2003. He paid £140 million for a club that was, at the time, carrying substantial debt and occupying a position in the Premier League that could fairly be described as mid-table ambition. Chelsea had won the league title twice in their history, most recently in 1955. They were a club with a large support base, a good stadium in West London, and no particular recent claim to greatness. Abramovich paid the money and immediately began spending considerably more than he had just spent. The summer of 2003 saw Chelsea spend more than £100 million on transfer fees. Damien Duff arrived from Blackburn for £17 million. Claude Makelele came from Real Madrid, where he had been so comprehensively performing the role of the player who makes everyone else look better that Real Madrid had not noticed until he had gone. Jeremy, Juan Sebastian Veron, Adrian Mutu, Joe Cole, Wayne Bridge. The squad was being rebuilt not gradually but all at once, which was not how English clubs had previously operated because it was not financially possible for English clubs to operate that way. The Football Association and the Premier League had rules about various things. They did not yet have effective rules about what happened when a billionaire with a personal fortune estimated to run to several £1 billion decided to spend that fortune on a football club. The spending was legal, the speed was unusual, the scale was unprecedented. Other clubs watched with a mixture of interest and alarm in roughly equal proportions. Abramovich's first manager, Claudio Ranieri, an experienced Italian tactician who had been making cautious but steady progress with Chelsea before the takeover, lasted one season into the new era. He was polite about it afterwards. Most managers are. He was replaced in the summer of 2004 by Jose Mourinho. Mourinho had just won the UEFA Champions League with Porto, a club from Portugal's domestic league, a competition that most English fans followed loosely and from a distance. Porto were not expected to win the Champions League. They won it with a style of football that was so evidently well organised and so evidently the product of a specific tactical intelligence that clubs across Europe began looking at the man who had built it. Chelsea were the ones who moved fastest. Mourinho arrived at Chelsea's Stamford Bridge in the summer of 2004 for his introductory press conference and described himself with the particular confidence of someone who has decided to make an impression and is very good at it, as a special one. He said, "Please don't call me arrogant." He said he was a European champion. He said he believed he was, in the sense of being among the best at his work, a special one. Nobody in the room quite knew what to write first. He was, in terms of his tactical preparation and his ability to organise a squad around a specific system, extremely good at his job. The Chelsea of 2004-05 conceded only 15 goals in 38 matches. They won 95 points, a record that stood until Manchester City's total in 2017-18. The title was won in April with matches to spare. Mourinho won it again the following season on 91 points. 2 consecutive titles by margins that suggested the competition was not entirely even. The 4004-05 Chelsea was built around a 4-3-3
that systematically demolished the traditional English 4-4-2. Playing two out-and-out strikers against Mourinho's midfield three and organised defensive block was, for most clubs, less a tactical decision than an act of misplaced optimism. The league's tactical landscape shifted. The centre-forward who held the ball and brought others into play, Frank Lampard arriving late into the box, Ida Good-Johnson dropping deep, became the template. The old partnership of two number nines, both facing goal, both competing for the same crosses, was quietly and effectively retired. And yet something was building in Manchester. Ferguson had not been idle. The youth academy had produced Beckham, Scholes, the Nevilles, and now a teenager from Madeira, signed from Sporting CP in 2003 for £12.5 million, was developing into something that had no immediate precedent. Cristiano Ronaldo was, at 17, a winger of extraordinary technical ability and very little restraint. He was quick and he was direct, and he fell over rather more than was strictly necessary when defenders came near him, which generated a particular kind of irritated attention from opposition supporters. He was also clearly going to be exceptional.
By the 2007-8 season, Ronaldo was not a teenager and he was not falling over. He was a fully formed forward of devastating efficiency, playing in a team that had accepted that Mourinho's Chelsea had disrupted a previously comfortable order and had decided to disrupt it in return. Ronaldo scored 31 league goals that season, a figure that, for a player operating primarily from a wide position, was something the record books required a few moments to accommodate. United won the title by 2 points from Chelsea. Then came Moscow, the 20th of May 2008, the Luzhniki Stadium, the first ever Champions League final to feature two clubs from the same country, Manchester United against Chelsea, an all-English final that reflected the degree to which the Premier League had become the wealthiest and arguably the most talent-dense league on the planet. United won, eventually, on penalties. Ronaldo missed his spot kick. John Terry, Chelsea's captain, a man whose appetite for dramatic football moments seemed inexhaustible, slipped on the wet turf and sent his penalty wide at the decisive moment. Edwin van der Sar saved Nicolas Anelka's penalty and the trophy went to Manchester. The game was played 3,000 miles from England in a stadium that seated 80,000 people, broadcast to hundreds of millions more. 12 years earlier, English clubs had been banned from Europe entirely. Now they were contesting the final between themselves, and the contest was about nothing so modest as survival. Abramovich stood in the rain and watched. The news broke on the 1st of September 2008. Manchester City had been sold. The Abu Dhabi United Group, a consortium connected to Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Deputy Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, member of the Abu Dhabi royal family, the possessor of a personal fortune that financial analysts described using words like extraordinary and incalculable, had completed the purchase for £210 million. It was, as major news stories go, an unusually quiet one to absorb at first. Manchester City had been an unremarkable mid-table presence for much of the previous decade. They had occasionally threatened things and occasionally delivered embarrassment, and were generally treated as a peripheral institution in the story of the Manchester rivalry. The new owner's first statement of intent arrived on the same day as the takeover announcement. Robinho, a Brazilian forward who had been playing for Real Madrid, was signed for £32.5 million, a British transfer record. Robinho, it later emerged, had believed he might have been joining Manchester United or Chelsea. He was joining Manchester City. He did not play badly, though he never quite played at the level the fee implied. This would become a recurring theme in the early years of the project. Large sums, considerable talent, results that arrived slightly later than the money suggested they should. The city of Manchester processed the news with the pragmatism of a place that has seen things before. United supporters were, for the most part, amused. City supporters were something more complicated, aware that this was significant, uncertain how significant, unwilling to believe too completely in something that seemed improbably large. The squad was rebuilt year by year. Carlos Tevez came from United, which provided a useful narrative,
Emmanuel Adebayor from Arsenal, Jolyon Lescott from Everton. City were buying from rivals, which was efficient and also made the rivals uncomfortable in a way that went beyond simple financial inconvenience. In 2011, Samir Nasri arrived from Arsenal, David Silva came from Valencia, Sergio Agüero, 23 years old, Argentine, possessor of the kind of low centre of gravity that makes defenders make mathematical errors, arrived from Atletico Madrid for £38 million. Roberto Mancini, an Italian who had won the Serie A title 3 times with Inter Milan, was brought in to manage the increasingly serious project. He was precise and occasionally brittle in public, and he worked well with the squad that was being assembled around him. City won the FA Cup in 2011, their first major trophy since 1976. It was a beginning rather than an end. The 2011-12 season reached its final day with Manchester City and Manchester United level on points. City had a goal difference advantage of 8, not insurmountable in a single match, but comfortably reassuring in most rational scenarios. City needed to beat Queen's Park Rangers. United were playing Sunderland. United won 1-0. They waited. City led Queen's Park Rangers at half-time. In the second half, QPR scored twice. City led 1-0. QPR led 2-1, with the clock running, with the mathematics of the situation becoming hostile. The City supporters in the Etihad Stadium were experiencing something that has no adequate description in calm language. A collective visceral terror familiar to anyone who has watched a football match where the worst possible outcome is arriving in slow motion and there is nothing to do but observe it. Edin Dzeko scored in the 92nd minute, 2-2, still not enough. City needed one more. At 93 minutes and 20 seconds, a timing recorded with a precision that the moment seemed to demand, Sergio Agüero received the ball 18 yards from goal, turned and shot. The ball went in. The commentator's name was Martin Tyler. What he said at that moment has been replayed so many times it has achieved a quality beyond memory, beyond sport, closer to myth. The City supporters in the ground did things with their bodies that suggested the release of several years of accumulated hope and anxiety simultaneously. Mancini ran onto the pitch. Agüero pulled his shirt over his head. City finished the season on 89 points. United finished on 89 points. City's goal difference was plus 64. United's was plus 56. 8 goals. That was the margin. In terms of trophy cabinet outcomes, it was the cleanest possible outcome, and in terms of emotional architecture, it was almost perfectly designed to be remembered forever.
Ferguson watched from the Old Trafford director's box where Sunderland had confirmed a United victory and waited for a title that arrived at the wrong ground. The Agüero goal ended one era and began another. United would win the title the following season, Ferguson's last, and then the club would spend the next decade attempting, with considerable resources and very limited success, to remember how they had done it. Alex Ferguson retired on the 8th of May 2013. He had managed Manchester United for 26 years and 7 months. He had won 13 Premier League titles. He had won 5 FA Cups. He had won 2 Champions Leagues. He had taken the club from a position of domestic mediocrity. They had not won the title for 19 years when he arrived in 1986, and turned them into, by some objective measures, the most successful English club in the history of the sport. He was 61 when the Premier League began. He was 71 when he stopped. The announcement was made on a Wednesday morning. By lunchtime, the football world was attempting to process what it meant. Nobody had expected it, which was itself remarkable given that Ferguson had been managing for more than 40 years and was operating in an era of immediate media saturation. The secret had been kept within a very small number of people. That, perhaps, was the final demonstration of the authority he had exercised throughout his career. David Moyes was appointed as Ferguson's successor that same day. He had managed Everton with considerable competence for 11 years, building teams that consistently punched above their financial weight, and Ferguson had endorsed him. The appointment was given the tone of a recommendation from a trusted authority rather than a competitive selection process. Moyes lasted 10 months. He was sacked in April 2014 with United 7th in the Premier League. Louis van Gaal replaced him. Van Gaal was a man of absolute conviction in his own methods, which was either an asset or a liability depending on whether his methods were working. At United, they mostly did not work. He lasted 2 seasons. The vacuum created by United's disarray was not immediately filled by a single successor. The league breathed differently without the gravitational force of Ferguson. What had been a predictable ordering of the elite, United usually with Chelsea and Arsenal providing credible competition, became something messier and more interesting, in the way that things often become more interesting when the dominant force removes itself. Liverpool came closest to filling the space in the 2013-14 season. Luis Suarez scored 31 goals and finished top scorer, in a season where Liverpool played with an attacking exuberance that neutral observers found genuinely compelling. Suarez himself was a complex figure, extraordinary talent, disciplinary record that tested the patience of governing bodies, the kind of player whose actions off the ball required a specific effort of contextual judgment. In that season, he was simply unstoppable. Liverpool led the table in April, a title they had not won since 1990 was beginning to feel possible. Then came Sunday the 27th of April, Anfield, Liverpool against Chelsea. Steven Gerrard, Liverpool's captain, their most important player for 15 years, a man who had given the club everything he had, received a pass from a defender on the edge of his own penalty area, lost his footing on the turf and fell. The ball ran directly to Demba Ba, who scored. Chelsea won 2-0. The moment Gerrard standing up, looking at the ground, the expression of someone who understands immediately what has happened, was one of those images that football produces periodically, where everything the sport can contain about hope and cruelty arrives in a single second. Manchester City won the title. Liverpool finished second. The following year, 2014-15, Chelsea won the league under Mourinho, who had returned to Stamford Bridge in 2013. Then came Leicester City. Leicester City in the autumn of 2015 were, by any reasonable assessment, in the process of attempting to avoid relegation. They had finished 14th the previous season. Their manager, Claudio Ranieri, was a veteran Italian of many clubs and occasional sackings, most recently relieved of the Greece national team job after they lost a World Cup qualifier to the Faroe Islands. The bookmakers, applying the arithmetic of historical probability to the club's resources and recent performances, offered odds of 5,000 to 1 against Leicester winning the Premier League. N'Golo Kante covered the ground that 2 normal midfielders might cover, operating with a relentlessness that seemed to exceed what the human body had been designed to sustain. Riyad Mahrez on the right combined technical elegance with a directness that made full-backs look as though they had been asked to perform a task they had not been adequately briefed on. Jamie Vardy scored in 11 consecutive Premier League matches, a record, with a directness and pace that defenders found not so much difficult as theoretically interesting to consider and practically impossible to contain. Leicester won the Premier League title with 81 points. The celebrations in the city lasted for several days. Ranieri cried at a press conference in a way that made some members of the assembled media uncomfortable and others considerably less so. The mathematical probability of what had happened, not just the odds quoted by bookmakers, but the actual structural improbability of a club with Leicester's resources producing a title-winning team, was calculated compared with other sporting anomalies and declared to be without precedent in modern professional team sport. Ranieri was sacked 9 months later with Leicester 3 points above the relegation zone. The chairman called it the most difficult decision the club had ever had to make. 2 managers arrived in England in the summer of 2016 who would, over the following 4 years, produce football of a quality and consistency that required the record books to be rewritten. Pep Guardiola came to Manchester City. He had managed Barcelona between 2008 and 2012, winning 3 La Liga titles and 2 Champions Leagues with a style of play so complete and so specific that football analysts spent the following decade attempting to produce adequate descriptions of it. He had then managed Bayern Munich, where he had won 3 Bundesliga titles. He was, by the broad consensus of serious football people, the best manager in the world. He was coming to England for the first time, to a club with extraordinary resources and a squad that had been partially but not fully built for what he wanted to do. Jurgen Klopp arrived at Liverpool in October 2015, though his effect on the club became most visible during the seasons that followed. He had won the Bundesliga twice with Borussia Dortmund, playing a style of football built around extreme pressing. Gegenpressing, which translates approximately as counter-pressing, meaning the immediate and furious attempt to win the ball back within seconds of losing it before the opposition can organise. The physical demands it placed on players were significant. The results, when the players were capable of sustaining it, were spectacular. Klopp identified Mohamed Salah in the summer of 2017 and signed him from Roma for £36.9 million. Salah had been at Chelsea earlier in his career and had not been given the sustained opportunity to demonstrate what he could do. He had rebuilt his reputation in Italy. At Liverpool, under Klopp, he became the most prolific goalscorer in the club's history, a feat that, given the history of the club and the names on the previous record books, required some contextual appreciation. In 2017-18, Guardiola's City became the first team in Premier League history to reach 100 points. They won the title by 19 points from Manchester United. The margin was the largest in Premier League history. The football they played was discussed in terms that drifted sometimes towards the hyperbolic, but the underlying numbers were such that the hyperbole was difficult to effectively challenge. The 2018-19 season produced something that had never happened before. City won the title on 98 points. Liverpool finished second on 97, the highest points total ever recorded by a team that did not win the Premier League. In the entire history of English top-flight football, no runner-up had ever accumulated so many points and not been champion. The margin between them was 1 point across 38 matches in a season where both clubs had essentially played the best football in their history simultaneously. That same season, Liverpool reached the final of the Champions League, their second consecutive final under Klopp, after a semi-final against Barcelona that produced one of the more astonishing individual matches in the history of European football. Liverpool lost the first leg at the Camp Nou 3-0, Lionel Messi scoring with a direct free kick that displayed a casualness about the physics of professional football that suggested he was operating with information the rest of the sport did not have. The tie, rationally assessed, was over. The second leg at Anfield, Trent Alexander-Arnold took a corner quickly, so quickly that the Barcelona players had not returned to their positions, had not processed that the corner was being taken, had not prepared themselves for the ball to arrive in the area. Divock Origi,
who had been standing loosely in the penalty area, reacted to the ball before the Barcelona defence did. 4-0 on the night, 4-3 on aggregate. Liverpool were in the final. They won the Champions League in Madrid that June against Tottenham, two English clubs. The final score was 2-0. Salah scored in the second minute from the penalty spot. The match was not especially close. Liverpool supporters who had waited for this for 14 years received it in the manner of people who had been told something they simultaneously believed with complete conviction and never quite allowed themselves to fully expect. The 2019-20 season, Liverpool won the Premier League title, the first time in 30 years, 99 points, confirmed in June 2020, in stadiums without supporters, because the pandemic had closed the grounds in March and the season had been paused for 3 months and then completed, behind closed doors, in a sequence of matches played in an eerie and particular silence.
Jordan Henderson received the trophy in front of empty seats. The Liverpool supporters who had waited 30 years to see their club win the league, who had made signs and sung songs and believed through 17 seasons of coming close and not quite, were not in the building. It was confirmed on a Thursday evening. The scenes outside Anfield where supporters gathered despite every reasonable instruction not to, and the scenes in living rooms and kitchens and gardens across Liverpool and elsewhere were entirely real. The trophy ceremony was something else, but the title was theirs. The pandemic changed everything, and then the game continued as though it had not. This is not entirely fair as a characterization, but it contains something accurate. The 2020-21 season began in September and was completed without supporters in most grounds for the majority of the campaign. The experience of watching football on television, always somewhat mediated, always somewhat removed, became something stranger. Artificial crowd noise was pumped into broadcast to fill the silence. Commentators who had spent careers calibrating their volume against the background roar of full stadiums found themselves speaking into a void. Managers gave instructions that for the first time in professional football could be heard clearly from the television cameras. In April 2021, 12 of the most powerful football clubs in the world announced the formation of a breakaway European Super League, a closed competition of permanent members to be played alongside but effectively in place of existing European competitions. The announcement was made on a Sunday evening. The 12 clubs included Manchester City, Manchester United, Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool and Tottenham from England, along with 6 clubs from Spain and Italy. The reaction in England was, to use a word that the style guide for this programme discourages, significant. The government threatened legislation. Supporters gathered outside stadiums with banners. Players and managers made public statements of opposition. Gary Neville on live television said things about the clubs involved in the register of someone who had stopped editing himself. Within 48 hours, all 6 English clubs had withdrawn. The project collapsed. Several senior executives offered apologies in the tone of people who had been surprised by consequences they had, in retrospect, an obligation to have foreseen. Manchester City won the Premier League that season, and then won it again the next, and then won it again in 2022-23, and then won it again in 2023-24. 4 consecutive titles. No club in the Premier League era had previously won more than 3 in a row. The 2022-23 season delivered, alongside the domestic title, the FA Cup and the Champions League. The treble, completed in Istanbul on the 10th of June 2023, when Rodri scored the only goal of the final against Internazionale with 20 minutes remaining. The parallels with United's 1999 treble were not lost on anyone who had been paying attention across all of those years. Manchester, specifically the eastern and less historically fashionable part of it, had now matched what the western and more historically prominent part had achieved in the most significant season in English club football history. City supporters, who had spent significant portions of the previous 40 years being treated as an afterthought by the wider football conversation, received this information in a variety of ways, most of them emphatic. Guardiola had arrived saying he was going to change nothing about his philosophy, and he had not changed it. He had simply found the players to execute it at higher and higher levels. Erling Haaland arrived from Borussia Dortmund in 2022 and scored 36 league goals in his debut Premier League season, which is not a figure the record books had previously been asked to accommodate for a player in their first year in the league. Then, in the 2024-25 season, something shifted. Manchester City, who had dominated the previous 4 years with the consistency of a geological process, faltered. Haaland was injured for periods. Key players aged. The extraordinary density of matches, the expanded Champions League format adding games that the human body does not respond to cheerfully, accumulated its costs. Liverpool, under Arne Slot, a Dutch manager who had replaced Klopp after the German departed at the end of 2023-24, citing the need to rest, won the Premier League title on 84 points. Slot had never managed at the level of the Premier League before. He had managed Feyenoord, where he had won the Dutch title. He had ideas about pressing and positioning that were consistent with the approach Klopp had established, which helped. And he had Mohamed Salah, who had by this point been at Liverpool for 8 years and was still performing at a level that seemed resistant to ordinary human processes of decline. 84 points, the lowest winning total in some years, but a title. The 2025-26 season is ongoing. The Premier League is, by any financial measure, the most powerful domestic league on earth. The 2025-29 domestic broadcast rights deal was worth £6.7 billion. International broadcast revenues have, for several years exceeded domestic revenues, which means the competition is, in terms of where its money comes from, more accurately described as a global entertainment product that happens to take place in English stadiums than a domestic football league that happens to be watched abroad. VAR, the video assistant referee system introduced in 2019 to 20, has altered the emotional experience of the sport in ways that supporters find difficult to articulate and consistent with their actual feelings about it. Goals are celebrated with a hesitancy that was not previously present in football. The pause before full celebration, while the screen in the corner of the stadium displays a graphic indicating that the technology is checking something. Crowds in grounds have, on multiple occasions, had goals scored and then ruled out after several minutes of review for offside margins measured in centimetres. The technology is precise. Whether precision in this context is an improvement on the previous arrangement is a question without an agreed answer. The sport feels, at this point in its history, legally complex in ways that do not lend themselves naturally to the romantic framing that football has traditionally used to understand itself. Governance questions, financial rule investigations, points deductions, the language of boardrooms and courtrooms. And yet the football itself, the actual event of 22 people competing in a defined space for 90 minutes, remains capable of producing things that no other human activity quite replicates on the best days and the best matches, when the best players find the right moments. That was always what people were watching for. What the Premier League built over 34 years was a version of the sport that its founders could not have imagined and would not, perhaps, entirely recognise. The money arrived steadily at first and then all at once and then in quantities that required new vocabulary. The broadcast deal of £304 million that began, it all would now represent, roughly, the transfer fee for one internationally significant midfielder. The clubs that signed it felt they were reaching for something large. What they were reaching for turned out to be considerably larger than that, which is one of the consistent features of the story. What was lost is not simple to name. The terraces are gone, Taylor's mandate accomplished that, and the safety arguments were not wrong. The goalkeeper picking up a deliberate back pass is gone. Changed in 1992, the same year the league began, a coincidence so neat that it tends to be forgotten. The supporter who could afford to attend every home match without particular financial planning, gone in most cases, though the degree to which this is directly attributable to the Premier League rather than to the broader costs of living in modern England is contested. What was gained is also not simple to name because gain and loss in this context are not opposites. The football is better, not occasionally better, consistently, structurally, technically better than the football that preceded it. The managers are the best in the world. The players represent the highest concentration of talent in a single domestic league on earth. The infrastructure of most stadiums would be unrecognisable to someone who last attended in 1985. This is all true. The implicit question the game has been asking itself for 34 years is whether the sport is for the people who watch it or for the people who own it. And the answer, if there is one, is that this question does not have a clean resolution, and that the sport continues regardless, in the manner of things that are large enough to continue. The league's history contains everything that football contains. Genius and luck and money and collapse and recovery and dominance and improbable resurrection. Eric Cantona and Shearer and Henry and Gerrard and Agüero and Salah. Ferguson and Arsene Wenger and Mourinho and Guardiola and Klopp. The Invincibles and the 5,000 to 1 odds in the 93 minutes and 20 seconds.
None of it was planned. The men who met in secret in 1990 intended to create a financial structure. They did not intend to create a story. The story arrived anyway, as stories do, through the actions of people making decisions under pressure in specific stadiums on specific afternoons with specific results. Brian Deane in a baggy shirt at Bramall Lane, August 92, the first goal. The pitch uneven, the crowd local, the name on the competition still new enough that nobody had quite decided what to think of it. Subscribe and let football carry you into the night. If you're still with us, sleep well. Good night.